I just like the sound of it.
No one expected the legend to disappear without a word. At 79, the man who once ruled Hollywood with nothing but a smirk and a stare has vanished behind closed doors, leaving only rumors and regret in his wake. How did Jack Nicholson, the face of rebellion, the voice of madness, the king of charisma, end up in silence, confined to a mansion with covered windows and no visitors allowed? For decades, he lit up the screen with fire and ferocity. But now, only shadows remain. What happened to Jack Nicholson? And why does his final chapter feel more like a tragedy than a goodbye? You may think you know the man behind the shining grin, but after today, you'll never see Jack Nicholson the same way again. Before Jack Nicholson became a name etched in the golden walls of Hollywood, he was just a boy in Neptune, New Jersey. And even that identity was built on a lie. Born in 1937, Jack was raised believing that his grandmother was his mother and that his real mother was his sister. This twisted family secret, hidden from him for over 3 decades, would later shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. He grew up in a modest, working-class household. His mother, Ethel May, worked as a hairdresser, struggling to make ends meet, while his sister, June, a young showgirl, was often gone for long stretches of time. But Jack never asked why. He simply learned not to. There was always an unspoken sadness in the air, a feeling that something was being withheld. Jack once described his early life as regular, but that word hides more than it reveals. Because what he experienced wasn't regular. It was emotional disorientation masked as normalcy. When he was 37 years old, a Time magazine journalist uncovered the truth. The woman Jack had always believed to be his sister was, in fact, his biological mother. She had gotten pregnant as a teenager, and, in the 1,930 seconds, such scandal was enough to ruin a young girl's life. So, the family agreed to bury the secret. Forever. Forever didn't last. When Jack was finally told the truth, both his mother and grandmother were already dead. He never got to ask them why, never got closure. Just a gaping wound masked by laughter and roles that let him become anyone except himself. I was very impressed by their ability to keep the secret, if nothing else, he said in a rare interview. The words may seem cold, but underneath them was the heartbreak of a man robbed of his origins. This early betrayal shaped Jack in subtle but seismic ways. He became fiercely private, allergic to intimacy, and obsessed with control. Acting wasn't just a career, it was a shield. He could be wild, unhinged, seductive, cruel, anything, as long as it wasn't himself. He channeled pain into performance. But the boy who once sat on a front porch in New Jersey, wondering why his sister didn't love him the way he needed, never really left. School didn't offer him refuge either. Jack was known for being bright but undisciplined. He often clashed with authority figures, especially those who tried to box him in. His sarcasm became a weapon. Humor, a mask. He was voted class clown in high school, a badge of honor that, for Jack, concealed a deeper ache. He had no stable father figure. The man listed on his birth certificate was completely fictitious. In truth, Jack never learned who his biological father was. Some speculate it may have been a married man. Others suggest even darker possibilities. Jack himself never dug too deep. Some ghosts are better left sleeping, but they haunted him nonetheless. The absence of paternal guidance, combined with maternal deception, left Jack emotionally rootless. He learned to rely only on himself and to never trust anyone fully. This detachment, born in a small, sunlit living room in New Jersey, would follow him all the way to Hollywood, where trust is currency and betrayal comes dressed in gold. There's a heartbreaking irony here. The man who would later become one of cinema's most expressive faces was, as a child, emotionally starved and confused by the very people who were supposed to nurture him. In interviews, he rarely spoke of his childhood, not out of modesty, but perhaps out of self-preservation. Because behind the sunglasses and smirk was a little boy still asking, "Why wasn't I enough to be told the truth?" Jack Nicholson didn't arrive in Hollywood like a star. He showed up like so many others, broke, invisible, and hungry. Not for fame, but for meaning. He was just 17 when he packed his bags and moved to Los Angeles to live with his aunt. He took a job as an office worker at MGM's animation department, doing grunt work, fetching coffee, filing papers. Ironically, he was surrounded by cartoon characters, but the roles he dreamed of playing were anything but animated. He wanted to act, to scream, cry, rage on screen. He wanted to disappear into other people's lives so he could forget his own. But Hollywood is ruthless to dreamers. Jack spent years going to auditions and hearing only one word: number. He wasn't handsome in the classic sense. His grin was too crooked, his voice too nasal, his presence too intense. Casting directors didn't know what to do with him. He wasn't a heartthrob. He wasn't a villain. He was different. He failed his first audition, then his second, then his third. He kept going. He took acting classes at night, sweeping the floors afterward just to afford the next week's lesson. He shared meals with roommates, sometimes living off canned beans and instant coffee. He read every script he could get his hands on, even the bad ones, especially the bad ones. Because Jack believed that if he could make those characters real, he could do anything. His first role? A low-budget teen crime film called The Crybaby Killer, 1958. He played a terrified young man with a gun and no way out. It was melodramatic and forgettable except for one thing: Jack was electric. But Hollywood didn't notice. For the next decade, he vanished into a sea of B-movies and exploitation films. The Little Shop of Horrors, The Terror, Back Door to Hell. Most actors would have quit by then, but Jack didn't. There was a fire inside him that burned through rejection. He wasn't acting for fame, he was acting to survive. Then came Easy Rider, 1969. Jack wasn't even supposed to be in the film. He got the part of George Hansen, a drunk, disillusioned lawyer, after another actor dropped out. It was a small role. But when Jack appeared on screen, everything changed. Suddenly, casting directors who once overlooked him were calling. Critics used words like magnetic and revolutionary. Audiences saw something raw, a madness behind the eyes, a man barely holding it together. And they couldn't look away. Still, the pain hadn't ended. Jack was gaining recognition, but not trust. Studios saw him as volatile, unpredictable. He refused to play by the rules. He turned down safe roles, choosing instead characters that were broken, defiant, dangerous. Not because he wanted to shock, but because that was the only truth he knew. Off-screen, he was still struggling. Money was tight, fame was fickle, and there were moments late at night, alone in a cheap motel room after a failed audition, where he almost gave up. But he didn't. He kept going. He channeled every rejection into resolve, every betrayal into brilliance. He knew pain better than most, and on screen, pain is power. By the time 5 Easy Pieces came out in 1970, Jack Nicholson was no longer a name, and he was a force. The man who spent over a decade clawing his way out of the shadows was finally stepping into the light. But even then, he never forgot what it took to get there. There's an old Hollywood saying, it takes 10 years to become an overnight success. For Jack Nicholson, it took 15, and every one of them left a scar. By the mid-1970 seconds, Jack Nicholson was no longer just an actor. He was a cinematic phenomenon. He had built an empire not by conforming, but by defying. In a town obsessed with image, he leaned into chaos. While others polished their smiles, Jack sharpened his edges, and Hollywood couldn't get enough. He redefined what it meant to be a leading man. He wasn't pretty, he wasn't polite, but he was honest, brutally, terrifyingly honest. On screen, he could tear your heart out with a whisper or burn down the room with a look. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975, wasn't just a hit, it was a revolution. Jack's portrayal of Randall McMurphy, the rebellious inmate who'd rather die free than live under control, became iconic. The film swept the Oscars. Jack took home his first Academy Award for Best Actor. But the applause was just noise. Behind the scenes, Jack's life was spiraling into excess. Fame had opened every door to parties, to women, to power. But with it came something else: isolation. He was invited everywhere, yet belonged nowhere. Surrounded by people, but understood by none. He once said, "I'm the guy who gets out of the limo and everyone cheers, and I still feel alone." After Cuckoo's Nest, the offers poured in. Jack could do anything, be anyone. The Shining, 1980, cemented his mythos. That axe, that face through the door. "Here's Johnny." It wasn't just a line. It was a declaration. Jack Nicholson had become larger than life. But life couldn't keep up. He won his second Oscar for Terms of Endearment, 1983, and later a third for As Good as It Gets, 1997. He became one of the most decorated actors in history, over 70 films, dozens of nominations, critical acclaim across 5 decades, a net worth soaring past $400 million, a legacy etched in stone. But none of it bought peace. He never married. Relationships came and went, often with headlines, scandal, and public meltdowns. His decades-long relationship with actress Anjelica Huston ended in heartbreak after years of betrayal. She once said, loving Jack was like loving a whirlwind, thrilling, but ultimately destructive. He had children, but rarely spoke about them publicly. He guarded his privacy like a fortress, refusing to let anyone too close. "I don't want people to know who I really am," he once admitted, "because I'm not sure I do either." As he aged, the fame became a burden. Fans wanted the wild Jack, the legend, the devilish grin. But inside, he was tired. Weary of being everyone's idea of Jack Nicholson and no one's version of himself, he was haunted by the roles he played. Men broken by power, madness, love. The Joker in Batman, 1989. Frank Costello in The Departed, 2006. Each character darker than the last. Audiences cheered, but Jack knew the truth. Those roles came from somewhere real. He didn't have to pretend to be damaged, he just had to stop hiding it. Even his fame came with strings. He couldn't walk down a street without being mobbed. He couldn't trust new people. Everyone wanted something. He couldn't escape the pressure to always be on, always deliver, always shine. The most famous smile in Hollywood had become a mask. And yet, he kept going. Project after project, film after film. Even as his health declined, even as memory began to blur, Jack stayed in the spotlight. Because without it, what was left? He had conquered Hollywood. He had become a god in a city of kings. But as he stood at the top of the mountain, he realized something terrifying. He had everything except peace. Fame gives, but it also takes. And for Jack Nicholson, the price was everything he couldn't get back. By the early 2010 seconds, whispers began circling through Hollywood's velvet corridors. Jack was forgetting lines, missing appointments, canceling appearances. Rumors swelled. Dementia, Alzheimer's, or something worse. The once razor-sharp actor who could memorize pages of dialogue in a single night now needed help remembering conversations from hours before. He denied it, of course. Jack was too proud, too Jack Nicholson, to let the world see him crumble. But those closest to him knew. The fire was dimming. In 2013, he stepped away from acting without warning. No press conference, no grand farewell, just silence. One of Hollywood's loudest voices had gone quiet. He stopped taking roles. He stopped giving interviews. Eventually, he stopped showing up at all. No more Lakers courtside appearances, no more Cannes red carpets, no more Jack. For a man whose identity was built on being seen, the disappearance was deafening. The official word was retirement, but insiders whispered the truth. Jack could no longer perform. His memory was fractured. His mind, once the sharpest in the room, was failing him. He couldn't act. He couldn't write. He could barely hold a coherent conversation. It was the cruelest twist of irony that a man who had spent a lifetime slipping into other people's minds was now losing grip on his own. He withdrew completely, retreating into his Beverly Hills estate. The curtains were always drawn, the gates always locked. Friends said he wouldn't answer calls. Some were turned away at the door. His once legendary charisma, replaced by confusion, paranoia, and long, empty silences. His decline wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Jack had always feared being forgotten. Now, he was forgetting himself. Some days, he'd stare at old movie posters on his wall, asking who the man in them was. Other days, he'd talk to people who weren't there. He refused caregivers at first, insisting he was just fine. But eventually, even he couldn't deny the truth. He was slipping, and no one could catch him. There were moments of lucidity, rare and painful. In one, a friend claimed Jack looked at a framed Oscar on his shelf and said, "What good is all that, if I can't remember why I earned it?" He rarely saw his children, not out of malice, but disconnection. He couldn't hold their names, couldn't place their faces. The man who once made the world feel alive now lived among shadows. And the media? They devoured it. Tabloids ran headlines like, "Jack's Final Days, a legend fading away," inside the tragic decline of Nicholson. Photos emerged of him bloated, vacant, unshaven, and they spread like wildfire. Each image a stab at the myth, a dismantling of the icon. No one asked if he wanted to be seen that way. No one cared if he was ready to say goodbye. Hollywood, the same machine that had once worshipped him, now watched his collapse like a slow-motion car wreck. And yet, Jack never responded. No statement, no denial, just silence. There were attempts to coax him back. In 2017, there was talk of a remake of Tony Erdmann, a chance for Jack to return, to reclaim his throne. But the deal quietly dissolved. He never showed up for rehearsals. He never even read the script. He was gone, even though he was still alive. And that was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Because Jack Nicholson didn't die in some blaze of glory. He didn't crash and burn or overdose in a hotel suite. His tragedy was slower, quieter, a gradual vanishing, like a candle flickering in a sealed room. For a man who once ruled the world, the ending felt almost too small. But maybe that's the truth about fame. It doesn't end with fireworks. It ends with silence. There's no dramatic comeback, no final role, no Oscar speech echoing through a thunderous crowd. Jack Nicholson's rebirth didn't happen on a screen. It happened in silence. In the hushed corners of a mansion surrounded by sycamore trees, in afternoons spent sitting by the window, watching the light shift on the hills of Mulholland Drive. In the rare moments when he could still remember who he was. For a man whose entire life had been about movement, rebellion, excess, this stillness was foreign. But with stillness came something else: clarity. Jack stopped chasing the past. He stopped trying to perform. There was no longer a need to be Jack Nicholson, the legend, the grin, the voice, the smirk, all of it could rest. He began to accept the boundaries of his new world. Conversations grew shorter. Days blended together. But in rare flashes, the old Jack would surface, telling a joke to a nurse, quoting a line from Chinatown, humming along to jazz records from the 70 seconds. These small moments, so easy to miss, became sacred. One of his children once said, "He's not the man people remember, but he's still Dad." It was a simple sentence, but for Jack, it meant everything. Because in the absence of memory, what remains is essence. And Jack's essence had always been love, buried deep beneath layers of bravado, sarcasm, and cinematic madness. He started reconnecting, in his own way. Letters to old friends, quiet visits from his daughter Lorraine, watching Lakers games from a private room, nodding when LeBron made a three. Sometimes he didn't speak. Sometimes he didn't need to. In his prime, Jack once said, "I don't want to be a role model. I want to be real." And maybe, in the end, that's exactly what he became. No longer the Hollywood rebel, or the devilish icon, just a man learning how to exist with less. Less memory. Less movement. But more stillness. More grace. He never wrote a memoir, never filmed a farewell documentary. He didn't want to be remembered as a ghost of himself, talking to a camera, clinging to relevance. Instead, he let go. Let go of fame, of validation, of performance. There's power in that. A final act, not of rage, but of surrender. A life no longer lived for applause, but for meaning. And in that surrender, Jack found something he had never truly tasted. Peace. For decades, he had run from himself into women, into characters, into madness. But now, there was nowhere to run. And in that stillness, he found something resembling wholeness. He may not remember every role, but he remembers love, the laughter of his children, the jazz of Coltrane, the face of his mother who was once his sister. And even if the world forgets, even if the legend fades, Jack Nicholson, the man, has found his way home. Not in triumph, but in truth. Once, Jack Nicholson lit up every room he entered, a living flame, impossible to ignore. Today, that light has dimmed. But perhaps, in that quiet, something even more beautiful remains. He no longer needs to roar, to laugh, to seduce an entire world through a lens. His legend doesn't rely on memory. It lives in feeling, the kind that lingers long after the screen fades to black. We remember The Shining not for the axe, but for the madness in his eyes. We remember Cuckoo's Nest not for the hospital walls, but for the moment he stood against the system for all of us. We remember Jack Nicholson not as a man who played characters, but as someone who made us feel seen in our own brokenness. Maybe that's the legacy that matters. Not awards, not money, but the quiet truth behind it all. The pain, the joy, the confusion, the humanity. He was never perfect. He never tried to be. But maybe, just maybe, that's what made him unforgettable. So now, as the curtain falls and the final frame fades, one question remains. Can a man still be great, even as he forgets who he is? Maybe it's up to us, the ones who watched, who felt, who remembered, to answer that. If Jack's journey touched you, if you saw a piece of yourself in his defiance or his silence, leave him something in return. A word, a thank you, a memory. Because even legends deserve to be remembered, not for how they ended, but for how they made us feel